Medfield TV, community shows.
The rest of the project, because they're going to have to piggyback onto that.
They have to decide where they're going.
They may have an easier course. And they'll go someplace else, but they may have.
We ought to get going.
Sorry,
We're listening.
I asked for this agenda item to be added.
I was talking about something important.
Okay, for this meeting?
I want to go to bed. Yeah, right?
Gong him.
I'm going to keep kicking the thing. Way past my bedtime.
I asked for this agenda item to be added to this agenda because we have a joint meeting tonight. And my intention here is to introduce an idea. Probably take 5 minutes to do it. And I'd like to do anything good like that? Okay. Probably take 5 minutes to do it. The topic is how we collectively should be thinking about approaching the budgeting process in future years. My perspective on what we've done in budgeting for as long as I was paying attention to what we did, so from the time I was on the warrant committee, is that the budgeting process has always involved a collaborative process among all the departments in the town. The conversations weren't always fun, they weren't always straightforward. Oftentimes the negotiations involved some compromise and some uneasiness. This year that didn't happen. As you know, the school committee basically decided to go off on its own. As you look at that process, realizing that the selectmen, the warrant committee, and the town administration, who I've always thought of as fiscal watchdogs, they're the ones that are the voice of the taxpayer. They all recommended against a 6.16% increase, uniform. And the voters, I'm not going after the school committee here, the voters basically at the town meeting said, well, we hear your recommendations, we are going to disregard them. The school committee said, you guys, I guess, have been enough of a pain over the years that we're going to take this to the voters, so we don't really care what you think. Well, it turned out the voters this year didn't care what we thought, and then with the election, I would have put this on the agenda regardless of the outcome of the election, but basically the town meeting vote was confirmed by the election yesterday. So what that does is that puts, I think, us, in particular the warrant committee and the board of selectmen, in an odd spot. Because if, in fact, the voters have affirmatively taken action that says we don't need you to be our fiscal watchdog, we will choose for ourselves and decide for ourselves what is and isn't reasonable, then they are their own fiscal watchdog. And our role as fiscal watchdog is, not what I would have originally thought it would be. I had access to I think it's a model that Weymouth uses, and I subsequently found out last week at the regional selectmen's meeting that the town of Millis is using it as well. The Millis selectmen referred to it as the Lexington model, so Martha, maybe they even do it in Lexington. What it is, and I'm not sure, I think, Tom, you sent this out to everybody, I think, and certainly Pete and Mike have had it. It's just a series of spreadsheets, so you have to almost decipher exactly what's going on. But the basic concept behind the spreadsheet is that at the beginning of the budgeting cycle, the calculations are made about what the Prop 2.5 growth is, and that growth is then allocated between the town side of the budget and the school side of the budget. So there's a baseline, everybody has the same baseline. That's, if you stay below this, it's Prop 2.5 compliant. If you go above it, it requires an override. And as I think about what happened this year, particularly the fact that the schools are 2/3 of the town operating budgets, and Mike Sullivan is the guy that is responsible for pulling together the town-wide budget, but he only controls 1/3 of it. I looked, I'm a little sensitive this year just because of the aftermath of the town meeting, I'll be honest, but we have people, including you all, who are trying to figure out a way to hammer out a budget for the entire town, and 2/3 of that budget is not controlled by you all. And my reaction to what happened this year is that the voters basically said, you know, you can kibitz on this if you'd like, but we're going to make our own decisions. So where I've taken that in my own thinking is that we actually should adopt a methodology for budgeting next year, which basically puts the accountability for budgets where the accountability can be put. Now, the model that you got on Weymouth is not the same as for us. My own quick thinking here is that we have an overall budget that breaks into 5 components. There's the town and school employee benefits, which is uncontrollable. There's the debt and principal, which is, I know it's controllable in terms of what debt is authorized, but in terms of what it costs, it's uncontrollable. And then through the capital stabilization fund at least, our capital spending now is specified. The process that I can picture, and I would like to, if we do this, I'd like to have Mike make sure that this is all right, but the process that I would see, and you have to allocate revenue, so school revenue, things that come in through schools go to the school side, highway department funds, things like that go to the town side. The allowable growth under Prop 2.5 then gets split in a particular proportion. In Millis, according to their selectmen, it's 35%, 65%. So in the ballpark is 1/3, 2/3. That's at least a stake in the ground for what Millis is doing. That gets allocated. That becomes the baseline guidance. It's mechanical. You pull out the growth in employee and town and school and town employee benefits. That gets pulled out first. You pull out the debt and principal, which right now on the trajectory, that's actually a benefit. That'll, for a year or two, that actually gives us more flexibility. And you pull out the capital that's pre-designated, and what's left gets split 1/3, 2/3 to those 2 budgets. And the schools decide for themselves if they want to go for an override, and the town will decide for itself if it needs to go for an override. Now, if one side or the other says, we don't need the money this year, you can have it, well, that's fine. But what I'm getting editorial here, but now that the election's over, I'll comment on this. I objected to the misrepresentation that the schools made that they had not had an override for 6 years. The only year that the schools had less, that met the Prop 2.5 limit was FY13, and that was the year after we'd approved the override that actually Bob McGuire asked for a year early because he really needed it the following year. So representing to the town that we have tightened our belts and we have avoided an override, or in Tim Bonvati's, and I love Tim, so I'm not going after him personally, but in his patch article when he said, I think if we do this, we'll be able to avoid an override for the next 2 years, it's like, are you saying that you're going to stay within Prop 2.5 limits? And the answer is no. The answer, I think, is, well, no, we've gotten used to the fact that the town does whatever is necessary to give us a 4% increase, and as long as the town keeps doing that, then you guys, if you'll pay the price, then we won't need an override. And I'm saying that's wrong. We actually need to have the discipline. Here's the good news. If something like this makes sense, your job just gets a whole heck of a lot easier. You're gonna, as a warrant committee, you can comment just as the board of selectmen. We can make our recommendations, but you're not on the hook to work into late March or early April trying to negotiate budgets. The school committee's budget is what it is. You'll either say you like it or not, and people will either listen or they won't, but the school committee will make its own decision of whether it needs to go to town meeting requesting an override to fund the school department budget, just like the town will do.
How is that any different from what happened this year? I mean, they could just choose to ignore it. They could just choose to ignore what we're giving them.
That's precise. Well, yeah, they can, but the difference, Joanne, it's what happened this year is what's caused me to go down this path. What has happened every year prior to this is all departments come together. The schools have always made a case that their costs grow faster than anyone else's. And then what's happened really is that Mike has had to figure out ways. Martha, I don't know how you did it last year. Because I just said, I was expecting what we had this year to be last year. I honestly don't know. Mike, I know you have some rabbits and hats, and you've been pulling them out for years. And I'm not sure how many more rabbits you have, because some of those reserve fund budgets are going downhill. So what happened this year is what's prompting me to say this.
So essentially is what you're saying, is that going forward, we would say to the schools, no more of this then I will give you 3%, 4%, whatever. You get 2.5%.
You get 2.5%, just like everybody
So
else.
it's not
But
so
yeah,
much a
yeah.
change in how we're doing things,
Right.
it's just that we're not gonna let that slide happen. We're gonna
But
say. you
but
get
it becomes more
2.5%.
mechanical, and it may be less than 2.5%, because if you have another $600,000 increase in in school and town employee benefits, 2/3 of which are the schools, that comes off the top before you see what's left on the allowable. So this year, $600,000 growth against the $1.3 million allowable, we only had like $700,000 plus or minus to play with.
So are you talking about a change in adding something into town bylaws?
No, I think,
To any fiscal policy?
Mark,
And like you,
I
like
think-
Mike,
I think
you
it's a
were
policy.
working on some fiscal policy.
For the capital and the reserve and all that.
Okay, so you're not talking about that.
we don't need a bylaw, this is a policy, and
Okay.
personally, I would,
So from a mechanical standpoint, I guarantee you, the schools are gonna come back and they're gonna say, the tracking sheet's wrong. We are being billed for water or sewer. There's gonna be some financial engineering.
that's fair. I mean, if you look at those sheets, they got, Weymouth has harbor master fees, and, I mean, that's my point, is I would want to get with Mike, because some of the detailed account, anything that's legitimate, that's not, I'm not sitting there saying, let's do an arbitrary cut, and then, good luck. It's like, that's the part that has to be figured
So-
out, but you can figure it out, it's a structure, it then becomes a mechanical calculation.
So a couple of thoughts. One, the day of the annual town meeting, I find out that the 6.16% increase includes 6 teachers, not 4 teachers. Okay, there's no personnel board that reviews what the schools do in terms of changing hours for their employees or adding employees. Number two, it was just about a week and a half ago when we found out what the actual 6.16% budget fully reflected. So you have this baseline now that, and it's done. It's a done deal. So
So that's my point.
So you're saying it's
My
going well,
point is
right?
that the voters this year basically said, we will be our own fiscal watchdogs when it comes to the school budget. All that, I fully understand.
Is this
why
an
you're
anomaly, or do
concerned.
you think this is gonna be the trend going forward?
I'm with you here, Tom. Gus, this is what concerns me, is I actually like where this conversation's going, and I think it's an interesting idea. What I don't like is framing it with the recency bias of how town meeting went and how the vote went, and saying that, there's a complete philosophical change in what the warrant committee is. I mean, you don't not become the fiscal watchdogs because someone goes out the back door and whistles through the graveyard. I mean, we're still the fiscal watchdogs,
So-
right?
Not if the voters won't listen to you. It's an academic exercise.
Okay.
I'm not
Haven't
saying you
they
don't.
always given this, I mean, the voters have always given the schools pretty much what they want. A few years.
And so was the
no.
warrant committee.
Well, so is the entire
Yeah,
town.
so I'm just
the town-
saying, is it such
entire town
the
has.
change is that the school committee asked for more this year than
And
they've
the
ever
school
asked
committee
for.
Here's
More after
the
the
issue,
superintendent presented to
and
us.
I did this, if anybody's
There's a
got,
tremendous amount of issues around that. When the superintendent came here to us and said he could live with 4.86, and they were like, we haven't approved that, and they went to 6.16. There's a travesty there.
Well,
Because,
I'll push back on that a little bit, Sharon. I'll push back on this. I have no problem with the procedure. I think you still end back in the same place, in that town meeting is the relevant deciding body. It's neither the warrant committee, the school committee. But I mean, from the standpoint of what the voters did this year, what happened this year, was that voters who wanted to spend more money on the schools than the superintendent originally said he wanted to spend, who wanted to spend more money on the schools than the warrant committee originally wanted to spend, they did exactly what they're entitled to do under the law. They went out, they recruited a candidate to run for school committee, he ran for school committee on a platform of spending more money on the schools, he won. The school committee looked at the election and said, you know what, this is what people want, they want to, and they shifted their budget higher. And then people came to town meeting, they voted on the budget at town meeting, because that's what they wanted to have happen, that's what they believed was the right thing to do, they believed it was necessary. I didn't hear anybody who was advocating for any of this saying, we want to do these things, we want a bunch of extras. We want a bunch of, they thought it was necessary for class size reasons, for all the reasons that were stated. Went to town meeting, and then they went to an election, and they won. I mean, so, I don't see this as necessarily rejecting the fiscal watchdog. I think this year, given the circumstances, the voters believed that it was a higher priority to spend that money on the schools than not. And they might be wrong, But I don't know that it's necessarily saying this means forever and ever, the warrant committee and the selectmen are also irrelevant.
First off, I'm not faulting the schools for doing what they're doing. They read the taxpayers, they said, we don't really appreciate your, fiscal discipline at the level you want to apply it, we're going to appeal to the voters. Now, 60% of the voters said that's what they wanted to do I don't know what the percentage was at town meeting, because it's volume dependent, but certainly at the election, 60% of the voters said that's what they wanted. 40% of the voters, a good portion of whom are either seniors on single incomes or families who are not seniors but are struggling to live in this town, that's the 40%. I've always felt like that's what I worried about more than whether the most affluent people could afford the taxes. It was the ones who weren't. I'm not faulting the school committee for doing what it does, but it is an advocacy committee. It is not a watchdog committee. And I'm not really, what I'm getting at is what happened this year is it caused me to step back and say, let me go back through all these years. Every year, the town cuts itself short in order to be able to give the schools more than 2.5% in order to avoid an operating override in the town. And I'm concerned about the damage that we're doing to town departments. I'm doubly concerned about the damage or the potential that we're setting ourselves up from a labor standpoint when we give 2% COLAs to the town and we have school contracts that sound like they're below 2%, but the schools say that they have a fixed labor cost growth of 4% of the budget. So there's something those two things don't work for me. And I'm not trying to...
Gus, with all due respect, I don't think it's in the budget. I believe we're looking at a fundamental socioeconomic change here in the town, okay? We are gonna see, as a result of housing stock turnover, the fact that average family income in this town will continue to rise. 140,000 now, 170 maybe at some point in time in the future.
Mhm.
Today, if you look at family incomes, we have 1/3 of the housing stock below 100,000, we have 1/3 between 100 and 200, and we have everything else above 200.
Mhm.
From the limited statistics I know, we are also seeing average family income rise.
Mhm.
We are a highly educated town. Incomes are going to continue to rise. There's going to be an increase in the number of people and they come for the schools. There's going to be an increase in the number of people that want to continue to support the schools. By the way, 42% of the families, per Mike LaFrancesca, in town had children in the school system, okay? So that's a big start whenever you have a vote, right? Doesn't take much more to push it over the top. So I think we got to look at where we want to be in the town. The question is, what kind of town do we want to be?
Well,
I personally don't want to live in a town at 250,000 average family income.
But you could vote with your feet.
What, please?
You can vote with your feet.
We may,
Right.
Tom.
But we can't address socioeconomic issues and upward mobility.
I
We
think
can't
we
do
just
that.
need to think about that, though, is where we want to be and what do we want to be as town leadership, okay? I would push back on that, Martha. I think as town leadership, we ought to look to the future. What kind of town do we want to have?
Well, but I don't understand how that translates into action, Pat.
I don't know what the answer to it, Gus, is.
So,
Okay,
so
although
what
I
I'm
suggest-
getting at, Jack, is I'm not convinced that 60% of the people who voted for the school budget, who had their own, I actually think it's now, the ones I knew of, were more in the elementary grades, interestingly, than the high school grades. So, the karma here is, well, if you're voting for your school budgets to grow like you are, you're gonna have to live with them for the next 10 or 12 years so that, the circle comes around. But Mike, the method behind the madness here is forcing, if the school budgets are gonna grow more than 2.5%, forcing taxpayers who have basically said we are the fiscal watchdogs for the school budget to confirm that they're happy every single year that the school department grows. I objected to the assertion that, well, we haven't had an override in the last 6 years. It's like, yes, you've had an override 5 out of 6 years. It's just that the town did what it was necessary to not require the taxpayers to cover that override.
You're
So I
gonna say,
think the
okay,
piece
we're
of
gonna
your-
force an override.
No,
you
no,
said.
I can just interrupt for a moment.
Yeah.
I think the piece of your procedure you're getting at is that really on the town side is we're gonna have it be 35%. We're not gonna let it become 25%.
Right, exactly.
And that's what you're saying, is we're gonna make sure that that's what the number is, what we're spending, whatever.
Right.
Okay. that's
Right,
what-
right, and my point is, because
It's a direction
if you
the
try
town
to,
administrator.
if the ward committee tries to negotiate a solution, or if Mike tries to figure out a way, when you were pulling stuff out of, when the override was being sold as an override that would cover both school and town budgets, when I knew what you did to get to a town budget that would allow the 4% increase to work, and then it was sold as, well, this is good for the town too, that was kind of soured me on this whole thing. It's like, no, we need to protect the town budgets, we don't need to go overboard, but we need to protect the town budgets. You don't need to drive yourselves nuts trying to negotiate a budget with a party that doesn't want to negotiate the budget.
But see,
You don't have to be driven nuts by being given control of
Losing our
1/3 of the
mission.
town
Right.
budget and held responsible for 100% of it.
but so you're banking on the fact that if you each say to the school, you're limited to 2.5%, and the school goes for an override every year,
Mhm.
that the taxpayers wouldn't just pass that override every year. And I'm saying based on the trends, I think they would.
I
And then I think
agree.
we lose
I
our
agree.
role as the fiscal watchdogs and we.
Well, you can still pass judgment on that.
Well,
but why are
we're
you
not here to
trying-
pass judgment, we're here to make sure that we don't spend too much money.
On
as a
whose,
town.
on whose behalf?
Nobody's else.
If the voters say we don't care, then you don't have to do that. You're doing something because you want to do it, not because they
Well,
want you
if
to
we
do it.
recognize that and we adjust the budgets accordingly, like we've always done, we recognize that the voters are probably gonna wanna spend 4% on the schools, and we're gonna have to find cuts otherwise.
Well,
So
but-
with respect to all parties involved, our committee needs more time to
Yeah.
read what was
Yeah.
sent, think about what was sent, form some questions. Appreciate your leadership in that direction. We've got to kick this one.
Yeah, that's fair.
I'd like to correct one thing you said.
Yep.
It wasn't 50% of the voters that approved the override. It was about 18%.
Of the
Well,
total,
the people-
well, but,
Because 2/3 of the voters didn't care enough to vote.
that's right.
There were 3,000 votes and there were 9,000 registered voters. So 50% of 1/3 is, or 51% is about 18%.
Sure, and it's worse than that, Mike, because of the ones who did show up. Of that 60% that voted, I would venture to say 20% of them, basically, because I've heard these quotes, I've gotten these quotes back, I've had friends basically say, so we're just voting everything across the board, right? And the idea, quote I got was, well, as I was driving into the polls, there were all these signs that said yes on Articles 1 and 2. But to me, what's happened is this town has trusted, the town has trusted, the voters will trust the town saying, if the town comes to us and asks for an override, it's because they need it, we're gonna support it. The controversy that was wrapped around this one was invisible to all but the people in this room and another 300 people, 150 people in town that actually pay attention to what's going on.
You know when it will become visible? When they get their tax bills.
Well, that's why, and it'll be
That's when they'll
visible
say,
if every
"How did
year,
this happen?"
and if there's, every year there's an override. They may go for 5 years, but at some point they go, why is every year an override? That was the model that the school committee talked about is, gee, 10 years ago, we had overrides every year, every other year. And it's like, and is that the model we want to go back to? And the answer was maybe.
Right, but I think
Also,
to Mike Pastore's point, and I think we should wrap this up, I do think we should avoid recency bias and avoid deciding that this is the start of the trend. We don't know what the start of the trend. It might be an outlier, it might not. Right? We don't know whether this is the 2004 override that's gonna be followed by 6 more years of them, or if this is one that sort of sticks out in the middle of, that was the confluence of a number of factors. We just don't know yet. And I think obviously for people who believe that we are not on a sustainable tax track, there's a lot of persuasion and work that has to be done. And I think, to be fair, and to your point, Gus, I think the folks who advocated for the 1 and 2, who worked on it, did what they're supposed to, did a lot of work. And there was nothing on the other side. And so it wasn't as though there was a robust debate, even at town meeting, on this issue. It may just be that the sentiment of the people paying attention was so much in favor of the override side that there didn't need to be a big election, but there wasn't. And I think, and I've had a brief discussion with Tom, and I think as we think about this, not just with this issue, but with other issues, I think we have to rethink, how we deal with some of these things, rethink how we go about some of the persuasive aspects of our roles. Ultimately, the warrant committee's only real function, even with the reserve fund, is as an advisor to town meeting. And so I think the warrant committee's got to think about it, and I think we're all going to think about it. For now, I think we have to adjourn this meeting.
Good. Mike, let me add one comment, which is.
I guess a second to adjourn.
The other side had a campaign and a constituency. We had a position. Campaign and constituency won, position 0.
And they had persuasive, factual arguments in favor. They
Not
may be right, they
factual.
may be right, they may be wrong.
Not all facts.
Jack, I
Not
don't
all
think anybody
factual,
knew the warrant
but-
committee or the selectmen's position on the issue. None of the people that voted, I don't think, knew it.
Well, but it's to Mike's point, we didn't promulgate it.
The warrant committee cannot promulgate. You could talk about what you could do at town meeting, you could talk about.
Do we have a second? This goes to
Second.
adjourn.
Do we
have a
allowed to give a second? It's your meeting.
We
Oh,
can't
you can
promulgate
adjourn
it.
your-
You're watching Medfield TV, community shows.